Well, welcome everybody to our today's session of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance virtual seminar series. I am very happy today to have Daisuke Ikeda from the Bank of Japan, who will be presenting his paper, Bank Runs as Coordination Failure in an Infinite Horizon Economy. Before I start, let me remind you the ground rules. So the seminar lasts 1 hour. The first 45 minutes will be dedicated to Daisuke's talk. And in the last 15 minutes, we will open the floor for further questions. In the meanwhile, while Daisuke is speaking, please ask your questions via the Q&A box, which you find at the bottom of your screen. So before I give the floor to Daisuke, let me thank him again for giving his talk also so late, considering that in Tokyo it's 10 p.m. And with that, Daisuke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing me, Francesca. Again, my name is Daisuke Ikeda, Bank of Japan. This is a joint work with Hidehiko Matsumoto Grips. I think he's here. So before starting, just let me say a disclaimer. The views expressed in this presentation are all mine, not the Bank of Japan. So I came up with the core idea of this paper, bank runs as coordination failures in an infinite horizon economy, when I was seconded at the Bank of England from 2016 to 2018, working with David on macro-prudential policy and research. David and Francesca, thank you so much for giving me this precious opportunity to present the paper. So let me start. As you know, the global financial crisis of 2008-9 prompted financial regulatory reforms, and the milestone is Basel III. The goal of Basel III is to promote a more resilient banking sector. Here, resilience means the banking sector's ability to absorb negative shocks. In the current context, the COVID-19 pandemic is a typical example of such negative shocks. The ultimate objective of Basel III is to protect the real economy by reducing the risk of spillovers to the real economy from the financial sector to the real economy. So to put simply, the goal of Basel III is to enhance bank fundamentals to reduce a crisis probability, a crisis that affects the real economy. So therefore, the Basel III posits a link between bank fundamentals and crisis probability. Especially if bank fundamentals are strengthened, the banking sector would become more resilient to negative shocks, and a financial crisis would become less likely. I call this link as a macro-prudential perspective. In this paper, we articulate this macro-prudential perspective in a dynamic model. So in this paper, we focus on a bank run as a banking crisis event. According to Reinhardt and Rogoff, most of the banking crises in many countries feature bank runs. And Bernanke argues that a financial panic is a culprit of the Great Recession in the US. So against this background, Gartra and Kiyotaki has made substantial progress by developing a dynamic model with self-fulfilling bank runs. But in their model, a bank run is sunspot driven, and the bank run probability is undetermined. So once the economy is in the region of multiple equilibria, a run can occur, but its likelihood is undetermined, irrespective of bank fundamentals. And this feature may not be in line with the macro-prudential perspective that posits a link between bank fundamentals, such as leverage, and the crisis probability. Another challenge for a bank run model, or a financial crisis model in general, is to explain Schularick and Taylor's empirical finding. They find that credit growth tends to precede banking crisis. That is, a crisis, financial crisis, is likely to occur during a credit boom. So, motivated by the macro-prudential perspective embodied in Basel III and Gartra and Kiyotaki's theoretical model, and Schularick and Taylor's empirical finding, we address 3 questions in this paper. First, how do bank fundamentals affect crisis probability? In other words, what is the mechanism through which bank fundamentals affect a financial crisis probability? The second question is, how can we explain Schularick and Taylor's empirical finding about credit growth? Why does a financial crisis tend to occur after high credit growth? We want to know the mechanism. We want to know the reason. And the third question is there any role of macro-prudential policy? To address these 3 questions, we developed a dynamic general equilibrium model that features 3 things. The first thing is, of course, bank run. And second, global games. A global game plays as a role of equilibrium selection, and it gives rise to an endogenous bank run probability. And third feature is macro-prudential too, and especially we consider restrictions on leverage, bank leverage. And then using the model, we studied bank run-led crisis and the relationship between bank fundamentals and the crisis probability and the effects of leverage restrictions. So in our paper, our main findings and contribution are threefold. The first contribution is that we develop a dynamic general equilibrium model with bank runs that explains a link between bank fundamentals and the crisis probability. A bank run-led crisis and its probability can be expressed as bank fundamentals, bank leverage in particular. And second contribution is that our model provides a unified framework for bridging 2 empirical facts: procyclical leverage by Adrian Shin, 2010, and credit growth as a predictor of banking crisis by Schularick and Taylor. In our model, leverage tends to increase during a boom period. Combined with the first results that bank leverage affects the crisis probability, this means that the crisis probability tends to be high during a boom period because leverage is high during a boom period. The high leverage induces credit expansion, leading to the empirical finding by Schularick and Taylor. So our model can explain Schularick and Taylor's empirical finding. And finally, we show that countercyclical leverage restrictions can improve social welfare. So as I already mentioned, this paper is motivated by Gartra and Kiyotaki, who embed self-fulfilling rollover crisis into a dynamic model with a banking sector. In their model, a bank run probability is indeterminate. To make it determinate and to explain a macro-prudential perspective, we introduce a bank run global game studied by Roche and Vives. So we introduce a bank run global game a la Roche and Vives into a dynamic model. So in my former paper in 2018, I introduced Roche and Vives into a two-period general equilibrium model and studied interaction between leverage and liquidity. But in this paper, we exclusively focus on bank leverage and extend the two-period model I studied 2 years ago to a dynamic framework. So in addition to this bank run model, so there are other macroeconomic models with nonlinear crisis dynamics. So basically, they are divided into two types of models. The one is occasionally binding constraints, and another is market freeze due to adverse selection. So these papers are complementary to our model. So in my view, occasionally binding constraints are especially studied by Mendoza. These occasionally binding constraints are more about farm and household financing, and market freeze due to adverse selection studied by Karat and Biggio and others. So adverse selection and market freeze, these are more about financial markets. But in our paper, we focus on financial intermediaries that are vulnerable to runs. So in the rest of my presentation, I will walk you through the detail of the model and numerical analysis. Okay, model environment. So the basic framework is a standard real business cycle model. So there is only one aggregate shock, exogenous shock, that is technology shock, or TFP shock. And there are 4 types of agents: households and firms, banks, and fund managers. Households and firms are, as in the RBC model, and banks intermediate funds from households to firms. And fund managers, on behalf of households, fund managers make a binary decision whether to run or not. Our modeling of fund managers closely follow Roche and Vives' partial equilibrium global game. In the policy analysis, we consider restrictions on leverage. So let me start from the standard part of the model. Households consume and supply labor and make deposits into banks, and banks intermediate funds from households to firms, and firms combine labor and borrowing and produce. And there is only one aggregate shock, that is productivity shock. Okay, let me start from household sector. Consider a representative household. The household has GHH preferences over consumption, C, and hours worked, H. A reason why we assume these specific preferences will become clear in a few slides. The household maximizes utility subject to the flow budget constraint. So here D is deposits, and R is deposit interest rate, and W is wages. And fee is lump sum transfers, including profits brought by banks. So in this model, to keep a representative agent framework, we assume that the household owns banks, but the household cannot freely inject capital into banks. In addition, we assume that the household cannot directly finance firms. So the only means of saving is bank deposits, D. This deposit interest rate, RT, this is risky, reflecting the possibility of bank default. If there is no bank default, the household receives the promised interest rate, which is determined in the previous period. But if bank defaults today, the household receives only a fraction V of the promised interest rate, and this V is called recovery rate, and it is, of course, less than 1. And V is determined endogenously in this model. So the household is aware of the possibility of bank default, So this is the description of the model regarding the household sector. So let me move on to firms. So there is a representative firm that combines capital K and labor H and produces output Y according to this standard Cobb-Douglas production function, and AT represents technology shock. And following standard AR1 process, and the shock, IID shock epsilon AT follows normal distribution. And the factor prices. So this firm is competitive, and so the factor prices, the return on capital and real wage, are determined by marginal pricing. So these are standard equations. For simplicity, we assume full capital depreciation, so that capital installed today is simply equal to investment made today. And good market clearing condition is that the output is used either as consumption or investment. Okay, let me move on to bank balance sheet. So as I said, banks intermediate funds from households to firms. For the sake of exposition, let me consider a representative bank. So in the beginning of each period, the representative bank has bank capital N. The bank combines this bank capital or bank net worth and the deposits D and lend to firms. And so the asset is the amount of capital, and the liability side consists of bank capital and bank deposits. So we define bank leverage L is equal to bank asset over bank capital as usual. So here is a reason why we assume GHH preferences. So with these preferences, the log of bank asset return, RK hat, follows normal distribution with mean mu and standard deviation sigma. The mean is time variant, depends on the productivity shock and capital installed yesterday. And the variance, standard deviation, is constant. So this feature, that the log of bank asset return follows normal distribution, this feature will be useful for introducing a global game into this model, as we will see later. But at this point, what we need to remember is just the bank asset return is risky and it follows normal distribution, which is derived by the assumption of GHH preferences. Now, I discussed fund managers who make a run decision on behalf of households, okay? So we have seen households, farms, and banks, but now we move on to fund managers who make a binary decision whether to run on bank or not. So here, I'd like to emphasize that this part closely follows Roche and Vives' paper, and its modeling is not our contribution. Our contribution is to incorporate Roche and Vives' global game into a dynamic model where all variables are endogenously determined. So bank asset return, bank deposit interest rate, and leverage, all these variables are endogenously determined in this model. But in the original Roche and Vives partial equilibrium paper, these key variables, bank variables like leverage, bank asset return, deposit interest rate, all taken as given, exogenously given in their partial equilibrium model. But here, these variables are all endogenously determined. So that's our contribution. So our modeling contribution lies in banks, not in fund managers. But in order to explain global game, we need to go into fund managers modeling. So fund managers. The deposit contract between households and banks is such that deposits made in PLT can be withdrawn early in the beginning of PLT plus 1 before they mature. So following Roche and Vives, we assume that households delegate a withdrawal decision to fund managers. In addition, again following Roche and Vives, we assume that fund managers follow a simple behavior rule in deciding whether withdraw funds or not. The behavior rule is such that withdraw funds if and only if their perceived probability of bank default, which is denoted as PI, is greater than a certain threshold, gamma. So this rule can be derived from a simple payoff structure for fund managers. But in the end of the day, all we need here is that whatever the reason, fund managers follow this behavior rule. A problem here is how fund managers formulate this probability, the perceived probability of bank default. So there is a continuum of fund managers. So there are many fund managers, and each manager is indexed by I. So before the withdrawal decision, each fund manager I, receives private signal about bank asset return, and this is noisy. So this signal is equal to true bank asset return plus some noise, and noise follows normal distribution. Using this signal, fund managers formulate the perceived probability of bank default, and if such a probability is greater than certain threshold, they actually withdraw funds. So this is how fund managers behave. So to understand how fund managers formulate the perceived probability of bank default, we need to look at under what condition the bank defaults actually. So in response to an early withdrawal request made by fund managers, the bank needs to liquidate some assets. But early liquidation is costly, so this is assumption, due to illiquidity issues. So let lambda denote the degree of such cost. So specifically, if the bank liquidates one asset early, the 1 unit of asset liquidated is worth only 1 over 1 plus lambda of RK. So if there is no cost, if lambda is equal to 0, then 1 unit of asset, the value is equal to RK. But because of costly liquidation due to illiquidity, if bank sells 1 unit of asset early, then it is worth only 1 over 1 plus lambda of the fundamental value, RK. So let X denote a run size, that is, the number of fund managers who withdraw. So there is a unit mass of fund managers. So if all fund managers run on the bank, then X is equal to 1. If no one runs on the bank, then X is equal to 0. So this is a run size. So with costly liquidation, the bank defaults if and only if this condition holds. The left-hand side here is what the bank has after costly liquidation. So this is the gross return on bank asset. And this is the cost of liabilities, including the cost of early withdrawal, lambda. And right-hand side is what the bank owes to depositors who haven't run. So the fund manager's perceived probability of bank default can be written as a probability that this condition holds. And this condition can be written in terms of bank asset return. So if bank asset return is less than the right-hand side, then bank defaults. And the bank formulates this probability using the signal received in the beginning of the period. So we've seen that the bank asset return follows normal distribution thanks to GHH preferences, and also the noise follows normal distribution. So this signal also follows normal distribution. Then we can calculate this conditional probability analytically. So this perceived probability analytically. So this is why we assumed GHH preferences and normal distribution. So in this environment, as shown by Roche and Vives, there is a unique equilibrium. That is, withdraw funds if and only if the signal received by fund manager I is less than certain level, S star. So given this threshold strategy, a run size X is given by this equation. So given this strategy, you can calculate run size, and you can calculate these thresholds by using iterative elimination, for example.
Daisuke, sorry.
Yeah.
I think there is a question.
Sure.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Do you mind if I jump in and ask you a question, Daisuke, on this?
Sure.
Very clear, your exposition in the model. So my question is about this PI and the kind of determinants of runs here.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking of like ways of like validating the model and thinking about whether it matches data that I'm familiar with. And I was thinking about some of the behavior of indicators like CDS premia on banks before the global financial crisis that were kind of very low. Lending spreads to banks were very compressed. Price to book ratios were kind of really high at that time. So those are all like market measures of investors' perceptions about bank risk. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you can kind of make the analogy in your model about what the kind of equivalents, if you were re-simulating the global financial crisis, say through the lens of this model, would it be consistent with those types of facts, or would you need more like a behavioral story of expectational errors around bank risk, if that makes sense?
So let me hold until next, hopefully. So next slide. Okay. So I think our model, at least, is able to explain the crisis probability tends to be high during a credit boom when leverage is high, or credit growth is high.
Yeah.
So our model is very, super simple, and so that so there is no, credit default swaps, and also it may be a bit difficult to come up with credit spreads. But typically, credit spreads can be defined as the return on capital, difference between return on capital and deposit interest rate. And I haven't checked how this spread behaves, but I think you make a very important point. So I need to check whether in the simulation how spread behaves in the run-up to the crisis.
I might just kind of follow. I mean, the way you put it is helpful. So you said when credit growth is very high, investors will perceive that bank risk is growing, if I understood you.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, in the last crisis, in the run-up to it, credit was very high, but investors kind of thought bank risk was very, very low because they were willing to lend to banks for
I see.
No, for no spread. Anyway, you continue. Thank you.
Sorry, before you continue, let me relate to you another couple of questions which have popped up now. So Martin Wheel is asking, what other asset is there for people who run from the bank to buy and what the market for this is like?
Yeah, so the simple answer is that households purchase from banks when banks liquidate assets early. And simplifying assumption is that there is an issue of illiquidity, and so that banks simply pass the capital to households at the discounted price. So there is no loss in capital in this economy, but the resources are transferred from banking sector to households. But due to illiquidity issues, banks receive less by selling assets.
Thank you. And sorry, a final question that I have here from Raghav Mathur, who asks if you assume, or is it assumed in the model, that the network effects, meaning the run by one fund manager, which causes simultaneous runs by other fund manager, if this is somehow included in your noise of the private signal that is given to fund managers, or you're kind of abstracting from these sort of network effects?
Yeah, so here, because the bank default probability depends on the size of run. So other fund managers who run on a bank. So in that sense, there is a complementarity, kind of a network effects. And so regarding a run decision. But once run happens, then if run is big enough, then the bank capital is wiped out. So there is a single big crisis. So there is no kind of a sequence of bank defaults, because here we simply assume the single type of bank.
Clear, thank you. Please continue.
Okay, let me move on. So by using iterative elimination, so we can calculate this threshold endogenously. And by using this threshold, we can also calculate thresholds for bank asset return such that the bank defaults if and only if bank asset return is less than the certain thresholds. So by using these properties, we can analyze the thresholds and then express thresholds as a function of leverage. And actually, these thresholds for run decision and bank asset return, these two thresholds are increasing in leverage. And so high leverage means greater run size because of high threshold. And high leverage means higher probability of bank default. So these are the results of a global game. And this is a link between bank fundamentals and crisis probability. And now let me move on to the bank problem. And this is our the theoretical contribution. The bank is protected by limited liability, as in a typical banking model. And the bank chooses leverage to maximize its expected profits, taking into account that its leverage affects a run size and the default probability. If the bank chooses very high leverage, then the default probability increases because run size increases. And so there is a more expected cost of early liquidation. The bank takes into this negative effect, takes it into account in deciding leverage to maximize profits. And there is a technical non-binding constraint, but this is just a technical constraint different from macro-prudential perspective. So let me ignore this constraint because this is non-binding anyway. And the first order condition of this bank problem is shown here. Okay. The left-hand side is a gross return of bank asset return. And it is equated to the interest rate cost plus the marginal cost of early liquidation here. Thanks to this marginal cost of early liquidation, the problem has an interior solution. So without this term, so this cost of early liquidation, there is no interior solution. But thanks to this, the presence of this, the cost of early liquidation and the default probability, there is an interior solution for leverage. So this bank first order condition looks a bit complicated, but we can simplify it if we consider the limit case in which banks, fund managers, the degree of fund managers' noise goes to 0. So this is a trick used in global game in order to get an analytical solution, and we use the same trick. And under this assumption, under this condition, the thresholds for bank run decision and threshold for bank asset return regarding bank default is given by this equation. And it is increasing in leverage and also increasing in the interest rate, deposit interest rate. So this equation shows that if leverage increases, then threshold becomes high, and so that more fund managers run on the bank. And the bank's first order condition is reduced to this simple expression. And in this limit equilibrium, fund managers receive almost accurate information. And so in equilibrium, regarding runs, there are only 2 cases, no run or full run. All fund managers run on the bank or nobody runs on the bank. There is no partial run in this simplifying case. So let me close the bank model by describing a low motion for bank capital, which is an important variable in this model. So essentially, the bank capital in the next period is today's bank capital plus retained earning. So we assume that the bank limits distributes a fraction 1 minus chi0 of profits, of net profits to households. So chi0 here is a new parameter we introduced into this model. The rest of the law of motion for bank capital is as in Gartner and Kiyotaki or typical financial friction model, such as Bernanke-Gartner and Gilchrist. And then the law of motion for bank capital is given by this equation. In the case of full run, the bank capital is wiped out, and N bar amount of bank capital is injected by the government, and so that the banking sector has to jumpstart from this low amount of bank capital, N bar. So that in the case of no default, the bank retains a fraction chi0 of net profits. If the profits are negative, then the bank has to use bank capital to absorb these negative losses, these losses. And finally, the bank remits a fraction 1 minus chi1 of bank resources at hand to the household while receiving a small amount of capital from the household. So this completes the description of the banking sector and the whole model. So now I will walk you through model parameters and numerical results. To conduct numerical analysis, we parameterize the model. For the sake of the time, let me focus on just a few parameters. The threshold default probability gamma is set at 0.53 to hit the steady state crisis probability of annual 5%. So in steady state, the crisis probability is 5 annual %. And new bank endowment and 0 is set in such a way that steady state leverage is 10. So bank leverage is 10. So this is the steady state value. And finally, we set a retained earning parameter at a very low value, 2.5%. And this value has to do with leverage procyclicality, as I will show you in the next slide. And let me mention the numerical solution. So we use parameterized expectation algorithm. So we use a global technique to solve the model. The model is highly nonlinear. So our model has two important features. And the first important feature is procyclical leverage. So this panel, so we simulate the model and plot a changing asset on the x-axis and plots a change in equity, so blue dots, and change in deposits, red dots. Okay, so this is just we look at correlation. But this figure implies that changing asset is mainly driven by a change in deposits. And in the bottom figure here, the changing asset on the x-axis and y-axis is change in leverage. And we see a clear positive correlation. And these two panels show that our model can explain procyclical leverage. And thanks to this retained earning parameter newly introduced, and we set it at very low number. If the retained earnings are very large, as in a typical financial accelerator model, then we don't see procyclical leverage here. And this is the relationship between percentage changing asset and percentage changing leverage. Actually, the relationship becomes negative. So we need this retained earning, small retained earning parameter to reproduce procyclical leverage, shown by, reported by Adrian Shim. Okay. And our second important feature is endogenous run probability. And run probability is increasing in leverage and also increasing in interest rate. And combined with the first feature of procyclical leverage, so during a boom period, leverage tends to be high, and so that the crisis probability tends to be high. All right, so let me look at the crisis dynamics, starting from the real economy. So these charts show the crisis dynamics. So we run the simulation for 100,000 periods and then identify a crisis event. So here we define a crisis as a bank run event, given that there have been no runs in the past 3 years. So we define such an event as a crisis, and then we extract crisis 2 years run up to the crisis and 5 years after the crisis. And this figure shows the output dynamics, and this is investment and hours worked. And these three figures show that crisis tends to occur during a real economy boom, when output is relatively high and investment is relatively high, and also hours worked. And this real economy boom is driven by high TFP because this is the only aggregate shock in this economy. And then crisis is triggered by a severe negative shock to the TFP. And then output investment decline severely and go through a severe recession and a slow recovery. So these charts show a banking sector. And especially this figure shows the bank credit around the crisis. And run up to the crisis, bank credit is higher than the average value. And so that's net worth also higher. So these two are consistent with the empirical observations. And bank leverage is also higher than the steady state value of 10, okay, slightly high. And run probability is higher than the steady state value of 5 annual %. So, but this probability is quarterly probability of bank run. But after bank run, the bank capital is wiped out, and the banking sector has to restart with a small amount of bank capital, and so that leverage shoots up. And this sharp increase in leverage is consistent with the observation during the global financial crisis regarding the market leverage. Actually, market leverage increased tremendously during the global financial crisis. Okay.
Daisuke,
So,
sorry, I just wanted to remind you that you have 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you. So let me show you the isolated effects of bank runs. So these 3 lines show our model, blue line, and red line is our model with the same shock but no run, and pink line. So this is the RBC model without banking sector. So the difference between pink and red line shows the financial accelerator because the difference is only from the presence of banking sector. And difference between red line and blue line is the isolated effect of bank runs. So bank runs, once bank run hits, the bank capital is wiped out and banking sector becomes dysfunctional. And so output investment decrease severely. Okay. So now let me show you whether our model is able to explain Schularick and Taylor's empirical finding. So to do that, we simply do the same thing as in Schularick and Taylor by running a similar regression, the same regression. And left-hand side is the indicator variable, whether there is a run, taking value 1 or not, 0. And right-hand side variable is credit growth 1 year ago and 2 years ago and 3 years ago. And then we run OLS, and the coefficients on bank credit growth are all significant and positive. And even if we run logit regression, the results are same. And our models, this model's estimation shows that 1 standard deviation increase in credit growth increases run probability by 1.8 percentage points, so which is comparable to the result by Schularick and Taylor. So this regression and its result shows that our model is consistent with the empirical finding by Schularick and Taylor. Okay. So I think I have 3 minutes. So using the 3 minutes, let me talk about macro-prudential policy. So here, the source of the inefficiencies. So there are a few types of inefficiencies, but the main inefficiency has to do with the fact that banks take as given the market-determined deposit interest rate in determining leverage. So if the leverage is lowered a bit, then the banking sector becomes safer, and so the deposit interest rate goes down. And again, the bank default probability goes down, and banking sector becomes safer, and so on. And so by restricting leverage, the banking sector becomes safer. So this is the kind of a source of inefficiency. And we consider 2 types of leverage restriction. The first is flexible leverage restriction. So leverage is equal to 1 minus tau times what would be chosen in the economy without restriction. So L star is what we've seen. Okay, but the actual leverage with restriction is the leverage lower by tau percentage points. And another type of leverage restriction is a simple cap on leverage. So we find that 2.5% tau is equal to 2.5% maximizes social welfare in the simulation. And then to show the effectiveness of this macro-prudential policy, we start from the average of state variables 2 years prior to runs and feed average TFP shocks from 2 years prior to runs with or without this leverage restriction. And by construction, without leverage restriction, there is a crisis, of course. But with this specific leverage restriction, the crisis is prevented. There is no crisis because leverage is lower and banking sector becomes resilient, and so that this TFP shock is not large enough to trigger a crisis in this economy with leverage restriction. But the leverage restriction entails some cost in the real economy. So if we look at stochastic steady state, output is lower and consumption is lower with leverage restriction. But if we look at the mean of the simulated series, output consumption are greater because there is the run crisis probability is a lot lower. So there is a lot lower number of crises in the economy with leverage restriction. So because of that, if we look at just the mean of simulated series, the output and consumption become greater with leverage restriction. And this is a final slide. And let me say that the restriction on leverage, the simple cap, is not a good idea because it restricts leverage when it is needed the most. So during the crisis, after the crisis. So as we saw, after the crisis, the bank capital decreases a lot, and so that leverage shoots up. But this high leverage is necessary to supply credit to the real economy. But if leverage is restricted at 15, then during the crisis, the bank cannot extend credit to the real economy. So here, and so that investment and output decline severely. So this is why a simple cap on leverage may not be a good idea. So let me conclude. So our paper has 3 contributions. One is our paper explains a link between leverage and crisis probability, and our model provides a unified framework generating procyclical leverage and explaining credit growth as a precursor of crisis. And our model shows some roles of countercyclical leverage restriction. So I stop here.
Thank you very much, Daisuke. So I will start by asking Gulcin Oskan, who wanted to ask a question. Gulcin, if you can unmute yourself, you can now speak.
Hi, Francesca. I have unmuted myself.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. I was going to ask you about the size of N bar, that is the size of injection to the banking sector immediately following the crisis period. The question is whether that drop in output is linked to the size of N bar, whether you have looked at that specifically.
Yes, exactly. So we set N bar at 30% of steady state net worth, and similar to Gatra and Kiyotaki, and replicating the observation of a decrease in market capitalization of banking sector during the global financial crisis. And so this is essential. If N bar is say 100% of steady state net worth, then there is no, recession after a bank run.
Sorry, could I just ask very briefly a follow-up question regarding your very last slide? You have concluded that it's not a good idea to have a fixed leverage restriction.
Yeah.
And I think we would all agree that countercyclicality is very important. Clearly, one main purpose of macro-prudential policy is to break the procyclicality of financial markets. Given your model, I wonder whether you are able to specify a negative relationship between LT and the credit growth that will give you exactly that result.
So your question is whether our model can implement counter-cyclical leverage restriction?
Yes. What is the specific form of counter-cyclical leverage restrictions in your framework?
So as I explained, I considered only two types of leverage restrictions. One is simple cap, and another is this type of leverage restriction. And as we saw, the leverage, so L star, this is leverage that would be realized without restriction. So this market leverage increases severely during crisis. So as shown here, the blue line. And so this restriction means that you allow for higher leverage after a crisis. So in that sense, this has a flavor of counter-cyclicality.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Gulcin. Daisuke, David has another question for you.
Hi, Daisuke.
Hi.
I mean, fascinating work. I was thinking of like applications you could use this for, because it's a very rich framework. One that came to mind that you might have thought about is the debate about TLAC and gone concern capital. So, or think of it as instruments that would kind of convert from debt to equity in the event of the bank failing. I was kind of wondering whether those instruments would be kind of a good idea viewed through the lens of your model, or whether they would give rise to kind of dynamics that I haven't thought about. There's issues there about what the trigger would be for the conversion as well, and whether it's a market trigger or a regulatory trigger. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested, but it might be something you could consider as well.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it. If we have the bond that can be converted into bank capital when crisis is closed, default is, closed, then that may help. That's a straight away intuition I have now, but I need to think a bit more how the model works with such a convertible bond. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good idea.
I specifically mean, like, if you think of the depositors as like investors in the bank, and if their claim is the thing that would convert, so rather than introducing a new asset, it would be a different way of writing the claim that they have on the bank. Anyway.
Thank you again, Daisuke. We're right on time, and I see we have no more questions. So let me thank you again for a really interesting talk, and thank all the participants. I also want to remind everybody that this is the last talk of our autumn seminar series, and we'll resume on February 15th. And with that, let me thank you, and bye, everybody.